when I got to GM, I had a Buick Grand Sport that I drove, and I had a U-Haul trailer hooked to the back of it with all my stereo and my clothes and stuff like that. And
what year and color was the Grand Sport?
A 65 Buick Grand Sport. I have a photo of it somewhere here.
Okay.
And a red one, red with black top. And that's what I used. That's what I showed up to GM driving. Very first day, it was just, wow, on top of the world. So interesting. That first day when I'm checking in and, new hires then went to design development on the first floor. Outside kept passing 2 silver mid-engine Corvettes. One was a two-rotor originally was silver, right. And the other was a 427. And McKeegan was driving the two-rotor, and Chuck was driving the 427. There were competing mid-engine Corvettes.
Wow.
And that was, my very first day at General Motors, and that's what was outside of the window as I'm trying to get settled in there.
Now, was Leo Knight running the program then? Who was in charge of design development?
Lee Knight ran that summer program.
Okay.
They spent so much time talking and not designing, and strategizing and not designing that it gave me plenty of time to sketch.
to work on your sketches. Yeah. So you're in design development.
Yeah.
You're inspired. What did you work on? What do you remember?
Well, the thing that was interesting, Harley Earl really created design development, or the school. And his whole thing back in the 30s was to hire people who were great artists, who had a great passion for automobiles, because there really weren't strong schools then. Right. And by the time I got there, I was really the last of the people who came from that kind of route. And by then, people were starting to graduate who had a more complete understanding of car design. So I was one of the last people to go through design development. But in design development, I did a 3-wheeler. Chuck loved 3-wheel cars, and so I did a 3-wheeler. Dave Rossi was a sculptor who sculpted the design. And I was there for a couple months. And then I went on rotation through a series of studios to help them get a better understanding of where I fit best and where I felt, where I could contribute the most. I spent 3 months in Advanced Chevrolet with Ron Hill and Gay Zaloxi, and they were working on an all-new Chevy Impala, which would have been for 77. But it was a real advanced design at that time. Spent time there, then with Jerry Hirschberg in Pontiac studio with Pete Meyer. And then from there to Advanced Buick, which was a crazy studio. Basically, it was a studio that Mitchell had. Mitchell was the head of design at the time. He had established this, it's called Advanced Buick, but it was really his Riviera studio. All they worked on was Rivieras. And I loved Riviera. I was a real fan of Riviera. My father had one, a 65, that I absolutely loved. So being in that studio was great. I was there for 3 months, and then they reassigned me to the Buick studio. And I spent 2 years in Buick studio. So it's like my first year I was on this rotation, then second and third year I was in Buick, and then I spent 20 years in Oldsmobile.
Let's talk about that. You were obviously, somebody decided, hey, he's an Oldsmobile guy. What are your thoughts when you think about that?
Well, the thing is, I was in Buick and loved working in Buick, and it was the first place where I was really making a contribution. And so I'd been in Buick for 2 years. Irv Wibicki called me into the office one day, and Irv said, Mitchell was still running the place, but Irv was like, part of the executive team. And he said, and I sat there and in Irv's way, his unique way, he said, how'd you like to design rockets? Immediately, thinking, rockets, the space age. Wow, you know, I mean, you know, my mind is just going crazy. He said, yeah, we need some help down in Oldsmobile, and we think you're the right guy to go in.
He knew how to sell it.
I mean, I love Herbert Bicky. I mean, I learned a lot from the guy, and his sketches are unbelievable.
Yeah.
I love them. I have copies of some of them. I just love them. But at any rate, so I went in.
Always smoke rising from somewhere.
Yes, you know.
Either a tailpipe or a cigarette.
If you knew Irv, he always had a cigarette in his hand. It's like it was glued to his hand.
Yes.
Cigarette. I mean, you know, as he's pointing and gesturing, that cigarette's right there. But I went in there, I was still an entry-level designer. It was a very lean period, you know, early 70s. They weren't hiring very many people, very few. And there were layoffs and gas crisis and all kinds of, you know, challenges. You know, there was a fuel crisis, safety crisis, all of this economic crisis. So they really weren't hired. I was like the rookie for the first 5 years I was there. So I went into Oldsmobile really as an entry-level designer, and I spent 20 years there. I just gradually moved up the ladder, all within Oldsmobile, up to, you know, the executive level as chief designer of Olds too.
One of my fellow historians asked me to ask you about the entering the industry at the time when the fuel crisis, for the early 70s fuel crisis hit, and what that was like as a designer when you're designing, you know, General Motors made big cars for the most part. What was that like for you as a designer to deal with that?
Actually, I had an advantage going in at that point in time because I was new. There were some designers who, because you had these twin challenges. One was safety and bumpers, and, you know, designers were used to putting a bumper wherever they wanted to put it. And it could have been just a little chrome blade.
Yeah.
And now these bumpers had to protect the car in one way or another. And engineers weren't quite sure how to do this. And every day the rules are changing. And this was before, you know, the more integrated soft bumper systems, you know, and so these are big chrome logs. And so a lot of designers had real difficulty with that. And then there were other, you know, challenges from a safety perspective. From a fuel perspective, you know, is the very first time we're doing wind tunnel tests. We're downsizing vehicles. And there are some designers who just didn't want to have anything to do with a small car and had real opinions about tailoring a small car that, you know, that weren't very kind, you know. And so it was the turmoil. And, you know, these bumpers kept growing every day, and you'd come in the next morning and that bumper may have fallen to the floor because of the weight of all the clay. And, you know, you walk it, it was not uncommon to walk in the studio in the morning, there's the bumper laying on the floor because, you know, they kept adding clay, but weren't adding armature, you know, that's because they were moving that fast.